the transducer is a piezoelectric transducer, and what we mean by that is it have these crystals, what we call the piezoelectric crystals. The other term for it, or what it means, is a pressure electric. That's what piezoelectric means. Um, uh, and when it's under the influence of an electric field, it change the shape of the crystals. And what you're actually doing is converting electrical energy into mechanical, that is sound energy. So the conversion of the electrical pulse to mechanical vibration of the crystals. And then when the ultrasound comes back to the transducer, then you're going to convert that sound energy again back into electrical energy, and that's what is displayed on the screen. So it's a conversion from electrical energy to sound energy, and then from sound energy back to electrical energy. That's what the transducer, the piezoelectric transducer, does. All right, so this is what it looks like. So this is when the electric field is off, and then when the electric field is on, so as we said, there's a change in shape of the piezoelectric crystals. And you should have just an idea of what the transducer. So when you have your transducer, or the probe, it is made up of a number of different materials, and it is made up of a number of different materials. And if you look at because remember, you have the lens, and we said that you have to be careful that you don't destroy the lens of the transducer. So the first layer, you have this epoxy filter on the outside, and you can feel that. Just above that, you have what we call the backing material, and then just above the backing material is the piezoelectric material. Then you have the acoustic layer and the faceplate. Okay. So if you're looking on the transducer face on, so when you look on the transducer face on, the first layer you come in contact with is a faceplate. Okay, that's the first layer, the faceplate, the acoustic lens, the piezoelectric material, the backing material, and then the epoxy filter. Okay, so this is when you're looking at face on, the faceplate first, the acoustic lens, the piezoelectric material, and then the back-end material. All right. So again, you have the matching layer, the active elements, and then when everything is powered up, then as we had mentioned before, the piezoelectric crystals, the electrical energy cause the crystals to vibrate, and you produce your ultrasound. Then the ultrasound travels to whatever structure you're looking at, hit the structure, comes back, it is reflected back, and then when the reflected wave strikes the transducer, it is converted from sound energy back into electrical energy, and you can observe what's going on. So that's it in a nutshell. So the piezoelectric transducer has the piezoelectric crystals, and the crystals can be either quartz or magnetostrictive. So those are the two more common type of piezoelectric crystals. So it can be a quartz or magnetostrictive. Piezoelectric ceramics tend to have low voltage. They can be heated up to about 300 degrees Celsius, and It can be barium titanate or lead zirconate titanate. So the backing material, what the backing material does, it absorbs the sound energy coming back to the transducer. It has a great influence on the damping of the transducer. It's most effective in damping when the impedance of the backing material and active elements are the same. The higher the frequency of the transducer, the thinner the active element. And the thickness of the piezoelectric element is usually 1/4 of the inherent wavelength. So basically, you just have to have an idea what these layers look like, where they are located. Okay. Okay. And when you use your piezoelectric transducer, there is something called the near field, and there's also a far field. The near field is what we call the Fresnel zone, which is close to the transducer, and the beams tend to be parallel in that area, and it's better for imaging. So if this is your transducer right here, backing material, piezoelectric element, your wear plate, then when the ultrasound beam spreads out, you have a near field which is close to the transducer, then a far field which is further out. Again, the near field is what we call the Fresnel zone. We're not going to go into this in detail, but just know that there's a near field, there's a far field. The near field is right up there. Far field is further out. Okay, we're not going to go into that. All right, now we come to what we call resolution, spatial resolution. And you must have heard this term over and over again. Resolution. What is resolution? And ultrasound physics is not the first time you hear this. You hear it when you go to buy a television. You want to know the resolution of the television. So you need to know the definition of resolution because it's important in ultrasound physics. So when we talk about spatial resolution, it's something in space. Okay? So it is the ability of an ultrasound system to distinguish between 2 points at a particular depth in tissue. So what we're saying is that it's the ability of the ultrasound system to see 2 points, whether they're side by side or they're above each other. So if you can see if those 2 points are very close to each other and you can make them out as 2 distinct points, then that system has a very good resolution. So just think about it a little bit. So, okay, don't just memorize what I'm saying. It is the ability of the ultrasound system to see 2 points which are close together. And if the ultrasound system, because if the ultrasound system is not good, it's going to combine those 2 points. And you're just going to see one object or 1 point. But if the ultrasound system is good, then you can see those 2 points as 2 distinct points. And that's a very good spatial resolution. But when we talk about spatial resolution, you have 2 types of spatial resolution. And we're going to go over these so you have a good understanding of spatial resolution. So just resolution, the definition for resolution is the ability of the ultrasound system to distinguish 2 points that are close to each other. Okay? And so resolution is measured in distance then. So you're going when we talk about resolution, it has to be distance. So if the 2 points are 1 millimeter apart and you can see them as 2 distinct points, then the resolution will be 1 millimeter. If it's 0.1 millimeter, you can see them as two distinct points, then the resolution is 0.1 millimeter. So it's measured in distance. Then we have axial resolution and lateral resolution. And again, this is really simple terms, but you have to understand what it means. So when we talk about something have a very high spatial resolution, that is, when it has a very high spatial resolution, that is, the distance between the points are very small. So you can distinguish 2 points when the distance between them is extremely small. So the smaller the distance, the higher the spatial resolution. Okay? Now we come to axial resolution and lateral resolution. So think about it. When you have 2 points in any system, the points can be, the points can be above each other. So one point can be here, and then next point is right here, So you can have one point here and another point here. And if you can see them as two distinct points, one there, one up top, and one at the bottom, this is what we call axial resolution. Axial resolution, when the points are above each other, okay, or when they're okay. So one point is above, one point is below, okay. So when they're perpendicular to each other, okay, then that's what we call axial resolution. As opposed to if the points are side by side. So you can have one point here and then another point right there. Right? So if you can see these 2 points as two distinct points, then this is what we call lateral resolution, because they're now parallel to each other. The points are parallel to each other. You can still see them as two distinct points. So this is what we call axial resolution. And this is what we call spatial resolution. Okay. Still, you want when you measure the resolution is the distance between the 2 points. The distance between the 2 points. So this is your this is your axial, this is your lateral resolution. So this is lateral. So they're both spatial resolution. So this is supposed to be a L. Sorry about that. Okay. So this is your lateral resolution. Okay. So axial resolution, when the points are perpendicular to each other, where you can still make them out as two distinct points. And then lateral resolution, when they lie side by side, they're parallel to each other, you can still make them out as two distinct points. Okay, and again, resolution is measured in distance. The higher the resolution, the smaller the distance. All right, so okay, so this bears out the point we're trying to make. If your probe is right up here and you have a point right there and a point right there, the ability to see them as two distinct points, this is axial resolution, okay? And you measure the distance between the 2 points and you can still see them as two distinct points. This is what we mean by axial resolution. As opposed to lateral resolution, the points are aligned side by side, they're parallel to each other, and you can still see them as two distinct points, even though the distance might be very small. So this is lateral resolution. Okay. All right, so axial resolution is the minimum distance that can be differentiated between 2 points located parallel to the direction of the ultrasound beam. Okay, so with axial resolution, the ultrasound beam is parallel. Okay, so the ultrasound beam is parallel to the points. Okay, so one point is there, next point is there. Okay, the ultrasound beam is parallel, running in the same direction as the points. And then with lateral resolution, the beam, ultrasound beam now, is going to be perpendicular to the points. So when we talk about axial resolution, is the minimum distance that can be differentiated between 2 points located parallel to the direction of ultrasound beam. And then there's something we taught when something named the spatial pulse length, and we'll go over that spatial pulse length. So the axial resolution is a half of the spatial pulse length. Okay, and the spatial pulse length is basically the number of cycles in a pulse times a wavelength. So let me explain that a little bit more, because you might get something like that. They might ask you, what is the axial resolution? And they will give you a pulse. So you need to know that it is a spatial pulse length divided by 2. So remember what a pulse looks like. So remember when we did pulse, we say a pulse may consist of, say let's use a pulse of, say, three cycles. So a pulse may consist of 3 cycles. Just think of this as a nice wave. All right, so you have, all right, so let's go 3 cycles. So think of it as 3 complete cycles. So you have 1 crest, 2 crest, 3 crest, and you have 1, 2, 3 trough. So this pulse have 3 cycles. So basically, when we say spatial pulse length, what is the length of the pulse? That's all it means. What is the length of the pulse? Remember, length is a distance. What we know that from crest to crest is one wavelength. From crest to crest is another wavelength. From crest to crest is another wavelength. So if we know the wavelength, and remember the wavelength is lambda. So if we can measure the wavelength, which is lambda, and we know how many cycles is in the pulse, to get the length of the pulse, we multiply the wavelength times the number of cycles. So the number of cycles times the wavelength give you the spatial pulse length, the length of the pulse. Okay? So what we're saying, the axial resolution is equal to the spatial pulse length divided by 2. That's all that means. Okay, so this is something you have to remember, and you need to know how to do it. Spatial pulse length. All right, so all right, so again, if you have 2 cycles, this is just 1 cycle though. So, you know, from crest to crest is the wavelength. So the spatial pulse length is the length of the pulse. So it is the number of cycles times the wavelength. So if you have 1 cycle, you just multiply it by the wavelength, or you know, so is the length. So, straightforward length. Um, that's all you're doing. Um, yeah, so that's how you get the spatial pulse length. Okay, it's the length of the pulse. So the pulse may contain 2, 3, 4 cycles. So once you know the wavelength, once you know the wavelength, you multiply by the number of cycles and you get the spatial pulse length. Okay? The axial resolution is the spatial pulse length divided by 2. And it's distance. The smaller the distance, the greater the resolution. All right, so axial resolution is high when the spatial pulse length is short, so the distance. So the shorter the distance, the greater the axial resolution. Okay, so the spatial pulse length is going to be small if the wavelength is short or the frequency is high. Okay, because remember, spatial pulse length, I remember the definition. Let me just write it out so you. Spatial pulse length, the axial resolution, sorry. Axial resolution is equal to spatial pulse length, that's a S, divided by 2. Okay, so again, the spatial pulse length is the wavelength times the number of cycles. Remember? Wavelength times the number of cycles. So what we're saying, the axial resolution is high when the distance between the particles are very tiny. So therefore, the shorter the distance, which is the shorter the wavelength, because remember, this is equal, the spatial pulse length is equal to the number of cycles times the wavelength. Okay? So the smaller this number, the smaller the spatial pulse length, the greater the axial resolution. So if the wavelength is short, then this number is going to be small. Okay? So the shorter the wavelength, and remember that wavelength and frequency inversely related to each other. So if you're talking about a short wavelength, you're talking about a high frequency. They are inversely related. Remember, the wave formula, the speed is equal to wavelength times frequency, and the speed is usually fixed. So if you increase one, you have to decrease the other. They are inversely related. Okay? So the axial resolution is the ability to see 2 points, which are the points are usually parallel to each other, but the ultrasound beam is going to be perpendicular to the points, and you can still see them. Okay, you can still see them as distinct points. That's axial resolution. The shorter the distance, the greater the axial resolution. Okay, axial resolution is equal to spatial pulse length divided by 2. Well, spatial pulse length is just the length of the cycle. So it's the wavelength, which is distance between crest to crest or trough to trough, times the number of cycles. That's the spatial pulse length. Okay. So therefore, if this number is small, the axial resolution is high. To get this number small, the spatial pulse length have to be small. So that means the wavelength have to be short, or the frequency have to be high, because they're inversely related to each other. So the higher the frequency of the transducer, the worse the penetration. So that is why, when you have high transducer, high frequency transducer, you can only see superficial stuff. Whereas if you want to penetrate deeply, you want to see structures as individual structures at a greater distance inside the tissue, you have to use a lower frequency. Okay? That is why when we do vascular ultrasound, because the vascular system is very close to the skin, we use a higher frequency because we can see structures that are very, short. The penetration is going to be short. Okay? So higher frequency transducer use the image structures closer to the transducer. That is why when we do vascular ultrasound, we use higher frequency transducer because we don't have to penetrate deep into the body to see vascular structures. They're usually more superficial. So when you're doing carotid scan, looking at the carotid artery, or you're looking at the blood vessel in the leg, you use a higher frequency transducer. All right. All right, so we now come to lateral resolution. So remember, when we talk about lateral resolution, the 2 points are side by side. The points are parallel, but the ultrasound beam is going to be perpendicular. Sorry, the ultrasound beam is going to be parallel. The points are side by side, but the ultrasound beam is coming straight down. Okay, so let me just draw that again. This is lateral resolution. One point is right here. One point is right there. And then the other point is right there. You still can see them as two distinct points. Okay, so this is what we call lateral resolution. The ultrasound beam is going to be perpendicular. It's going to come down. It's going to be perpendicular to the points. So it is still the distance, resolution, spatial resolution, which encompasses both lateral and axial resolution. These are spatial resolution. So it is the minimum distance that can be distinguished between 2 points located perpendicular to the direction of ultrasound beam. So the ultrasound beam is coming straight down, which is perpendicular. And you still can see these 2 points, even though they might be very close to each other. You still see them as two distinct points. And so when you get a television, you want to make sure that the television has a high resolution so that you can see two distinct areas close to each other. Okay? So, the ultrasound is the same thing. But this is a lateral resolution. Lateral resolution is affected by something we call beam width and the depth of imaging. Okay? So the lateral resolution is high when so this is the formula for lateral resolution. So we usually talk about the near zone length. So the lateral resolution is high when the near zone length is long. So the higher this number, the better the lateral resolution. It's the near zone length. And this is the diameter squared divided by 4 times the wavelength of the ultrasound beam. Okay, as opposed to axial resolution, which is spatial pulse length divided by 2. And the lateral resolution is high when the near zone length is long, and that's the diameter of the transducer squared divided by 4 times the wavelength. All right, so that's lateral resolution. All right, so these are the factors that affect the near zone length. The factors that increase the near zone length is a short wavelength. So the shorter the wavelength, you're going to have, so just go back. So, the longer, the longer this number is longer or greater if the wavelength is short, or if your the aperture, which is the diameter. So if the diameter is large, that's the diameter of your transducer. That's what they call the aperture. So if the diameter of the transducer is large, it's going to increase your near zone length and hence the lateral resolution. If the wavelength is short, then it's going to increase your near zone length and increase the lateral resolution as well. And then remember that wavelength and frequency are inversely related. So if you talk about a short wavelength, you have to talk about a high frequency. So these are the things that increase the near zone length and as a result increase your lateral resolution. That means you can the ultrasound system is a good one, and you can see your structures clearly as distinct structures. They don't just merge them into one. Okay? Again, when we talk about a pulse is when the piezoelectric crystal is activated by an electrical field. Remember, when you plug your system in, you have your piezoelectric crystals. They're going to vibrate. So the electrical energy is now converted to ultrasound energy or a sound energy, and that's then you're going to have a pulse being created. The pulse may have 2, 3, 4 cycles. Okay, so the electrical energy is converted to the sound energy. The ultrasound waves are then created, and each group of ultrasound wave is a pulse. So again, the pulse gonna consist of a sound wave which may have 2, 3, or 4 cycles. Okay, so this is what we mean. So this is one pulse, this is another pulse, this is another pulse, and this is another pulse. Okay, so see if you understand that. So when when you plug your system in, the electrical energy causes the piezoelectric crystals to vibrate, and then you create your ultrasound waves, and then the waves may have one pulse, and then have another pulse, another pulse. So you said this pulse it's basically one cycle. So this, you have a crest, you have a trough, you have a crest, and then another trough. So this pulse is like this, and then so this is a pulse, and then you need to know what they call what is meant by pulse repetition. So it's just basically the pulse is repeating itself. So when you have pulse repetition, this pulse is repeating itself, but it's repeating itself, every at a specific time interval. Say at 1 second, it repeats itself. So every 1 second, you have a pulse, you have another pulse, and you have another pulse. So the time interval between the pulse is what we call the pulse repetition period, because ever so, the pulse is repeating itself. Pulse repetition period. So you can calculate the spatial pulse length, and we showed you how to do that. It is the number of cycles times the wavelength. That's the spatial pulse length. That's the length of the pulse. And then you can also calculate the pulse repetition, the pulse repetition period. Okay? You can also calculate the pulse repetition period. It's basically the time for each pulse to recur. Okay, all right. Now, again, this is a pulse, it's another pulse, and it's another pulse. Okay, so you can calculate the length of the pulse. As we said, the length of the pulse is so this has 1, 2 cycles. So if you multiply the wavelength times 2, you get the spatial pulse length, or the pulse length. Okay, so one pulse, another pulse, another pulse. Okay. So the pulse repetition frequency is the number of pulse per second. Okay, just like you talked about any other frequency. So Anyway, we will come back to that. So again, the pulse duration or the pulse length, the length of the pulse is just the length of the pulse, which is the wavelength and the number of cycles, the distance. Okay, so the wavelength and the number of cycles. The pulse duration is the time from start to finish. Okay, that's the pulse duration, which is the period times the number of cycles. Let me go back. So when this pulse, you can calculate the length of the pulse, but you can also calculate the duration, how long it's going to last, how long the pulse is going to last. So remember, we talk about the period. The period is the time to complete one cycle. So from here to there, the time to complete, the time to move from here to there is a period. Time to move from here to there is a period. So that's the pulse, the pulse period. But the total length of the pulse, which is the duration, pulse duration, the time it's going to take, is equal to the cycle length times the period. The cycle length times the period. So the pulse duration is the time from start to finish, which is equal to the period times the number of cycles. So just the time it takes to complete the pulse. That's the pulse duration. So, you know, you need to sit down and draw these things. If you don't draw it, if you don't have a good spatial brain power, these things are going to be jumbled up. Same thing that we're talking about. That is why if you don't have these, if you cannot visualize these things in your head, you need to sit down and draw them. Okay? So the pulse repetition period, okay, is the time from the beginning of one pulse to the beginning of the next pulse. So the pulse repetition period. So this is a pulse, and then if the time from here to there is whatever, so every say 2 seconds. So every 2 seconds the pulse is going to repeat itself. Okay, and that will be the pulse repetition period. Okay, it is a time from the beginning of one pulse to the beginning of the next pulse. So the time from the beginning of this pulse to the time to the beginning of the next pulse is the pulse repetition period. Pulse repetition period. And the pulse repetition period, it is the time from the beginning of one pulse to the beginning of the next pulse. So just like we did when we did regular sound wave, time is measured in seconds, pulse is, you know, pulse. So the pulse repetition period, the unit of that is the number of seconds per pulse. If you look at pulse repetition frequency, it's going to be 1 over the pulse repetition period. Just like when we did regular sound waves and we talk about the period is equal to 1 over the frequency. Same thing. Okay? A pulse, another pulse, another pulse, another pulse. Okay? You can find the length of the pulse, you can find the duration of the pulse, okay? And you can find the pulse repetition period. How many, what time interval the pulse is going to repeat itself. But the pulse repetition period is 1 over the pulse repetition period, frequency, or the pulse repetition frequency is equal to 1 over the pulse repetition period. Okay, frequency and pulse are inversely related. And it's important to understand this concept because they will ask you, they will give you, so they will give you the pulse repetition period, and from that you might have to calculate the pulse repetition frequency. Frequency and period are inversely related to each other. Frequency and pulse are inversely related to each other. So that's why the frequency, pulse repetition frequency, is 1 over the pulse repetition period, and vice versa. So if you have one, you have the next. You don't have to, all right? So the pulse repetition period, as the imaging depth increases, the pulse duration. So just common sense, if you imaging a structure which is deep, if you imagine a structure that is deep in the body, then the imaging depth increase and the pulse duration also increase. Okay? Okay? And as the imaging depth decrease, the pulse duration decrease. All right? All right. So again, you have to sit down, draw these things until you understand them. There's no other way, unless you have a scientific brain and you can just pull these concepts out of the air. Okay, if you've never been introduced to these concepts, you have to sit down and draw them. Now we come to the duty factor. And so all these things you're going to get in your exam, so you have to have an understanding of what they are. So when we talk about the duty factor, what are we talking about? So when you look at any mechanical system, and say you turn on whatever, it's gonna be on for a short period of time. Okay. Similarly, when you turn your transducer on, it's going to produce pulse for a certain period of time. Okay, so the percentage of time that is producing the pulse is what we call the duty factor. So duty factor is actually a percentage. It's a percentage. So it's the percentage of time that is actually producing the pulse. So the percentage of time that the producer is producing, the transducer is producing a pulse, that's what we call the duty factor. It's not going to produce a pulse usually all the time. However, it can. So the definition for duty factor is the pulse duration. Remember, we say how to get pulse duration. It is the period times the cycle length. That's the pulse duration. And then the pulse repetition frequency. Sorry, the pulse repetition period, which is 1 over the pulse repetition frequency. So this is the duty factor. Okay? The pulse duration divided by the pulse repetition period. So if you go back to this, so the pulse duration would be the number of cycles times the period, and then the pulse repetition period, that's all the time for each pulse to recur. So the duty factor is the pulse duration divided by the pulse repetition period. Okay? If they give you the pulse repetition frequency, 1 over the pulse repetition frequency equal to the pulse repetition period. And you can simply get the pulse duration by the pulse period times the cycle length. Okay? But duty factor is something that you have to remember. Pulse duration divided by the pulse repetition period. So a low pulse ultrasound system, so it spend more time, what we say, listening. So when you have your when you have your P doubler, so when you have your P doubler, okay, P doubler send out a pulse, so and then it's waiting for the return in ultrasound. So it send out a pulse, wait for the return in ultrasound. Send out a pulse, wait for it. So this is this is more important for PW, where you can, as opposed to CW. Because remember, CW is continuously sending out and receiving. So the pulse, it's 100%. The duty factor for CW is 100% because it's continuously sending out and receiving. Okay, so the pulse duration and the pulse repetition period, they're about the same. Okay, so as opposed to pulse wave, where it sends out a pulse and then wait for the returning pulse. Sends out a pulse, wait for the returning pulse. Sends out a pulse. That is PW. Continuous wave Doppler constantly sending out. Okay. All right. So let's look at this. So this is a pulse, and for your pulse wave, it sends out a pulse, then it's wait for the returning echo, then it sends out another pulse, and that. So this pulse has 1, 2, 3, 4. So 4 cycles. Okay, so you can actually get the pulse length or the pulse duration. So the pulse duration is just the period times the cycle length. Okay, so you can get the pulse duration, and then the pulse repetition period. So you have to understand what these concept means. The pulse repetition period, you have one pulse, and then after a certain time, then you send out another pulse. Okay, the time between them is the pulse repetition period. Period mean time. To get frequency, you just divide it by 1. Okay, and then you get the pulse repetition frequency. The duty factor is the pulse duration divided by the pulse repetition period. All right, that's a duty factor. It's usually a percentage. Okay, I am not going to go over temporal resolution because this is going to take another change in how you think, and so I don't want to go over this new concept just yet. But just like how you have spatial resolution, you have temporal resolution. Okay, so go over the what we did this morning. Try and fully understand it. Draw it.